web controls, user controls, and custom controls. So in this nugget, we're going to sort of broach the two main types of customized control that you can create in ASP.NET. We'll probably start with a custom control, which is a little bit more difficult, and we'll talk about a user control. So those are the two differences. And of course, I'll explain what the differences are and when you might want to use one over the other. So first, a bit of background. We're going to be talking about two distinct things here: web user controls and web custom controls. Now, the idea here is that you've kind of gone beyond what a regular ASP.NET control can do for you, and you need to make your own. The first way you might look is a web user control. They're really easy to make. Essentially, they're a little sort of self-contained part of a web page that can be stuck into other pages. You can build a little login control that has a label and a button and a couple of text boxes. So developing them is easier. It's pretty much just like making a web page. You can create them in the Visual Designer. You can separate your code from the HTML. You can have events for execution. However, they're not compiled. So when you go to include these in a website, you have to include what is essentially your source code. It's in an ASCX file, and it has to be compiled dynamically by ASP.NET. That means they can't be added to the toolbox, so it's a little bit tougher to work with them in Visual Studio. When you include them in a web page, you don't necessarily see the entire control at design time. So it can be a little bit more difficult to work with. And the only way to share a copy of that between different applications is to physically copy it, which means if you decide to make changes to it, then you've got a lot of more copying to do to keep up. So they're easy to create. They're a little bit more limited for anybody who's using a visual design tool like Visual Studio. You have to keep a separate copy of the control for every application that uses it. You can't add it to the toolbox, and it's good for fairly static layout situations. Now, the next step up is a web custom control. That's compiled code. It actually gets compiled to a DLL. Makes them easier to use, more difficult to create. They have to be authored in code. Now, once you've created the control, you can add it to the toolbox. You can display it in a Visual Designer with a properties window and all the other design time features that Visual Studio gives you. You can keep a single copy in the global assembly cache and share it between different applications. Now, that's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're going to cover here, but do know that you can include them in the the global assembly cache, the GAC or GAC, and it's something you might want to look into if you think it might be useful for you. Now, if your control has a lot of static layout and it's really just kind of a bundle of a little portion of a web page and that's all you need it to do, a user control is easier. If the more your control becomes dynamically generated, like if you're creating rows of a data-bound table or nodes of a tree view or something like that, you start to move to a custom control. So custom controls are harder to make. They do give you full visual design support. You only need a single copy per server if you put it in the GAC. You can add it to the toolbox, and they're better for dynamic layout. So the first thing we're going to talk about is actually the custom control. Let's start with the hard one first. Let's bounce into Visual Studio here, and I've actually got a project all set up for this. So let's see here. Let's start with the control itself. This is a custom control. I've imported all the namespaces I need. You'll notice that I'm inheriting from an existing class. So I don't necessarily need to write these things from scratch. I can extend an existing class. In this case, I'm extending a label. I've given it some information that'll help it be displayed in the toolbox, so some metadata there. And let's just kind of do a little bit of a walkthrough here. So normally when you create one of these projects in the project menu, a new web custom control, it inherits from the generic web control class. I chose to inherit from label because I really wanted sort of a super duper label, and so this lets me pick up all the functionality that a label already has. I've created a property here called default username. This is all metadata that goes along with it. This is its description. There's no default value. It is data bindable. It is localizable. And then I've just really provided a property getter and a setter so that people can retrieve the contents of that, which ASP.NET needs to be able to do, and a programmer could set the contents of it. I also have a render contents method. Now, this control writes text to the response stream by overriding the inherited render contents method. The default web UI control and the label already has a render contents method. I didn't need to override this. However, by overriding it, I give myself control of the actual HTML that's output. So you'll notice one of the things passed in is an HTML text writer, and that's what I'm going to use to actually write my output. And you can see that happening right down here. So this actually makes several calls to the write method. Depending, well, there's two in this if group. There's one right here, and thought I had another one. Oh, there it is, down at the bottom. And so rather than performing string concatenation and putting everything together into one string and then writing that, I just write a bit and a bit and a bit and a bit and a bit. And that's actually good for performance. Concatenation takes a little bit of overhead, whereas just writing directly to the HTML text writer is pretty fast. So I don't have the time and the memory required to do string concatenation. So it's okay to do multiple writes to that output stream. Generally speaking, if you're rendering a single element in your control, you should overwrite the render contents method and not the render method. There is a render method that invokes render contents after rendering the opening tag for the control and its style attributes. So you would lose control of the style rendering logic in that case. So this render contents gives me the most control over the content here. Really, that's about all that's in here. You can see I'm at the end of the class there. So the next thing I did, let's close this. I created a new website project, added it to this solution. I made it the default, so this is what's going to run when I execute this solution. And I added a reference to the project that contained the server control. So this second project is now a reference in the first project. That in Visual Studio actually automatically added it to, oops, I need to open up a page here. That automatically added it to the toolbox. There it is, welcome label. And well, you're going to see some problems here, and I'll tell you why. I'll show you what I did to mess this up. Let's go into the source first of all. What I did was I added that control to the page. That automatically added this registration prefix here, or directive here. So it's registering the assembly, the DLL. And by the way, before I was able to add that to the toolbox, I did have to build the server control. That's really important to know. If it's just sitting out there as source, it won't work. You actually have to build it into a DLL. And this is going to register that DLL, its namespace, and a tag prefix. I decided that I didn't want to have to do this on a page-by-page basis, so I started typing it into my web config file. And you can see where I did that right here. So what I didn't do is actually finish this. And one of the reasons is because I wanted you to see where I got this information. So it used a tag prefix of cc1, and then server control 1 is everything else. So if I do server control 1, we'll leave the tag prefix as cc1, which stands for custom control 1. You can totally change that though, and you should change it. Now let's see if my page picked it back up again. Not yet. I probably have to go and save this, but whoops, didn't mean to take that out of there. Save. Now we can close it. So the idea is that by registering it in the web.config file, you make that control available to all the pages in this web application. By just dropping it onto a page from the toolbox, what you'll be doing is creating a registration directive in that page. So you can kind of decide if it's a control you're only going to use on a single page in your website, then there's nothing wrong with just dropping the registration directive into that page. But if you were only going to use it on one page, you probably wouldn't have gone through the trouble of creating a custom control in the first place. So I'm kind of thinking you're going to want to put it in the web config in most cases. So that's a web custom control. Now let me shut down Visual Studio, and we'll pull up an example of something simpler, a web user control. Oh, by the way, before we do that, I guess I should mention there is a type of web custom control called a composite control. And a composite control is one where you don't really add a lot of code. You're creating a custom control. So you're going through all the steps I just showed you, but you're primarily relying on the functionality of existing child controls. So that's creating your user interface and performing your logic. Because you're relying on existing controls for your functionality, it's a lot easier to develop than implementing all of that functionality yourself. And there's a kind of a newish thing in newer versions of the framework. It used to be that when you made a composite control, you had to implement an interface called iNaming container, and you kind of need to have that in your head. And its job is to identify a container control that creates a new ID namespace so that any controls added to that container are guaranteed to have their own unique ID. You don't actually need to do that anymore. Instead, these days, when you create a composite control, you make sure that you derive it from the composite control class. So that was actually introduced in ASP.NET 2. So if you ever created custom controls back in the dark ages of ASP 1.x, you did have to implement the iNaming container interface, and that created a new naming scope for your child controls. You also had to override a bunch of things and stand on one leg and sacrifice a goat under the light of the full moon and all kinds of nonsense. But now, all the way up here in modern ASP.NET 4.0, all those steps are handled by the composite control class. So if you are creating a composite control, take a look up on MSDN's website on composite web controls. There's a lot of examples and a lot of details about how to do that, and you just need to make sure that you are inheriting from the composite control class. So if your class was, let's say you started off your project with public class welcome label, like I did, then your next line of code would be inherits composite control, and then it takes care of all that for you. All right, web user controls back into Visual Studio. Now, you might think that to create one of these, you have to pop open a new web user control project, and you would be wrong. You would spend a lot of time looking for it because these things don't get compiled as their own project. They're part of a website. So to create one, I'm going to add a new item to this website, and this is where I will find a web user control. So this is just an ASCX file. You can see it's just a web page. I'm just a web page, and I can add buttons and text boxes and hyperlinks and images. Oh my. This isn't a composite control. The composite control I was talking about is a composite custom control. This is just a web user control. That's all they are, is existing elements that you've pulled in and sort of put together in a particular way. So when I save that, they don't show up in the toolbox. Nothing here. Can't add them to the toolbox. What I can do, though, is add them to this page, and the way you do that is actually kind of intuitive, but it's simpler than it took me a long time the first time. You drag it over like that. Boom. Now, this new version of Visual Studio, newer versions of Visual Studio do let you see this, but you can see I can't get in here and edit it, right? I'm clicking on it, but it's just all one big thing, which is exactly correct. If I wanted to edit it, I would need to actually open up the control and do so. It does not have properties. It's just a big ol' HTML element. Let's take a look at the source. And I'm just, it's automatically created me a UC1 user control namespace. Here it is right here. UC1 goes with web user control 1. And it has an ID, and it's going to run at the server. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Now, what you can do is take some of the properties of these controls and expose them to the web page that will contain your control. So to do that, I need to jump over here. I need to get into the web controls code behind file. So we'll view the code. And I can create a little property. So I pasted that code in. All I've done is I've declared that as a public. Well, it's going to look like a property, but it's just a string. And then in the pages load, I'm taking that and sticking it into the label1.txt. So this gives you the ability to set that programmatically. And you know, that's about it. These guys are pretty simple little beasts. They don't require a lot of work. Like I said, they're easy to develop. It's just a web page, and it gets included in as a chunk inside of whatever other page you'd like it to. So useful technique, definitely something that's valid, especially if you only need to use it within a particular web application. And just, you know, it's a little bit less flexible and a little bit less mobile than a custom control. In this nugget, we've talked about web user controls. That was the second thing we did. A little bit easier to develop, just sort of a little encapsulated mini web page that can be included within a project. A little bit more simplistic to use, doesn't really require as much development effort as a custom control, which gets compiled to a .NET DLL, can be registered in the global assembly cache, can be distributed, you can register it in web config, use it across multiple projects. Definitely a little bit more work, although there is a variant of that called a composite control, which just combines the elements from different things. Acts as sort of a container that way, and gives you kind of a leg up to develop those things a little bit more quickly. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you